and welcome. I'm Deirdre Byrne from Five Leaves Bookshop, and today we're meeting Jeffrey Boakye. It's a great pleasure. We're here to talk about his new book, Musical Truth, A Musical Journey Through Modern Black Britain. Jeffrey is an educator and author of many books indeed. He's a specialist with a specific interest in race, masculinity and popular culture. He's written very widely on Black British culture. And Jeffrey, your book goes from the 1940s up to the present day, with each chapter focused on one song or say one musical track, and some are instrumental. It comes with its own playlist. I now think more books should come with a playlist.
Yeah, I agree.
Welcome. And can you give us a taste of the book? Can you read a part of it to give us a sense of what it's like?
Yeah. Let me, first of all, thank you for having me, first of all. I always love getting into conversation, and it's a real privilege to be here. I'll just jump into the some of the first pages, actually, after the intro. So from early on in all our lives, we learn history, our own history and the history of the world around us. Sometimes it's in a classroom, sometimes from the TV, or it might be from your parents, grandparents, aunts or uncles, who won't stop telling you about what it was like when they were young, with phrases like, I remember the time when. But these stories are important. They can show us what happened in the past, help us work out what life was like before we were born, and if we pay enough attention, they can even help us understand what might happen in the future. You might have learned about the Victorians, the Romans, the Egyptians, who knows? But what about the untold stories? What about the people who don't end up in textbooks and exam papers? This book is going to open up a few of these stories and give you a few more pieces of the puzzle. It's going to take us on a journey through Black British history, exploring how Black culture has developed over time and influenced British society along the way. And we're going to do this through a selection of songs. Why songs? Because music is powerful. Music is life. Music can carry the stories of history like a message in a bottle. And it can do three very important things. Music can be a celebration. Music can be a way of talking about oppression. Music can be a type of resistance. For me personally, music has done all of this and much, much more. Ever since I was a child, I've loved exploring worlds outside of my home through songs and lyrics. Even before I owned any music of my own, I would listen to the radio or songs that were being played at parties and lose myself in sounds and rhythm. Music has always had a powerful impact on my life. Reggae and soul could calm me down, while hip hop and dancehall could make my heart start racing. I would dance for hours with my siblings and cousins, lost in the joy that music can bring. That's the power of music. And I'll pause there. So that's just a little brief taster of musical truth. What do you think, Deirdre?
I loved it. I loved the book, and I really liked the way it jogs different memories. I mean, for me, it was Eddie Grant, Electric Avenue, which says something about my age, that I did recognize lots of the others, but that's the one that stuck in my mind.
Oh, that's brilliant.
And,
I love that.
Yeah. Could you tell us, I mean, I know you've given great reasons why music, but how did the idea first occur to you, or when? Has this been boiling under for a long time?
Well, I've written about music before, right?
Yeah.
So my very first published book was all about grime, but it was actually about the history of kind of Black Britain and Black masculinity through the lens of that genre and all the tracks that kind of led up to it. So I'd already sort of proven to myself that music was a fantastic vehicle to do social commentary and actually to get into some quite tricky areas of debate, you know, politics, identity, social justice, racism, prejudice, discrimination. You could do all that through music. So I knew that if I wanted to widen the conversation and kind of bring in younger audiences, I knew that music would be a great way of doing that. So when I started thinking hard about how I wanted to talk about Black Britain to a younger audience, you know, because ostensibly this is a book for younger audiences, school age people. But the trick is, the spoiler alert, is that I wrote it with a sense of the young person in everyone, you know, because I feel like we're all just babies. We kind of trick ourselves into thinking that we're mature and adult and we know what's going on. No one knows what's happening. Like, we're just trying to get through it all. And we've just learned what we've learned as infants. So speaking to that child within everyone was something that required me to find a good, you know, means of having a universal language. And music is something which you don't need to understand to feel it. You don't need to understand every reference or understand every artist and their narrative to feel what they're expressing through music. You know, it truly is a universal language, and that's universal. It's also cross-generational. So to me, it was the perfect vehicle for achieving quite lofty aims, you know, like, you know, quite big goals.
I do see what you mean. Like, lots of writers of colour talk about you're missing out of the history books, you're missing out of so-called serious literature, that the excitement of seeing a person of colour on television, for instance, you know, Lenny Henry talks about it, Mira Sayal, that's popular culture is definitely a way of representing when other mediums should but don't. Interestingly, you begin by saying it's not just that Black history and experience is left out, but also rewritten wrongly, that there are deliberate elisions or deliberate rewritings. And I think the book is really good at addressing that.
Yeah, that was really, I mean, this is why it's called musical truth, because actually knowing the truth of what happened is the start of the conversation. If you don't hold the mirror up and just look at it and just say, who are we? How did we get here? Then you can't really have a sensible conversation going forward. So a lot of what this book is trying to do is to just reveal basic truths of what happened, you know, expose the hidden and marginalized narratives. There's more Black British history in this book than I was taught in my entire educational career, including university, including postgrad studies to become a teacher, you know, and I've put more of those narratives and stories and individuals and ideas into, you know, 30,000 words than I had in 21 plus years, you know. So I feel like that was always one of my personal challenges, to make sure that it shone the light on experiences that have been deliberately hidden or obfuscated or kind of accidentally hidden over time. Because if you're not taught something, you know, any teacher now was very recently a child being taught, and their teachers were also quite recently children being taught. We're looking at recent history. The last 200 years is nothing, you know. So along that time, if you don't know what you don't know, then it becomes further and further away from the current lived experience of you know, young people. And that is something which I feel quite passionately about exploring. So I definitely look at people, moments that have been marginalized. And there's lots of that in the book.
It's amazing the way some names, like William Wilberforce, for instance, as a great abolitionist, forgetting completely that the resistance was coming from Black people themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
And how we end up knowing names like Rosa Parks. I mean, I loved your story about the Bristol boycott. Why don't we know about the Bristol Bus Boycott? Why don't we know about these names?
Yeah, these are very, very important stories for not Black British history, you know, world history, hugely important stories. We have to know how the Notting Hill Carnival came about, you know, who is Claudia Jones, you know, these are activists. Who is Marcus Garvey? What happened at the Bristol Bus Boycott, the no colour bar dance in Lambeth, you know, deliberate attempts to break down racism at a time when racial discrimination was like hugely negatively affecting lots of different communities. It doesn't take long to get to these stories either. You don't need a TED talk, you know, you can just anecdotally share. And I feel like it says a lot that these narratives have been, you know, removed or squashed from mainstream discourse. Because the other thing as well is that there's a lot of celebration in there. When you talk about the Bristol Bus Boycott, these are figures, these are moments in history that we can celebrate collectively, you know. And that's something which I feel the current conversation surrounding racism is sometimes so insecure and so scared of finger pointing or blame, that it forgets that most of these narratives are celebratory because it's aiming for basic social justice, which is something that we can all celebrate. So yeah, hopefully, no, not hopefully, I know there's a lot of triumph and joy in the book, as well as exploring these unpalatable truths about what actually happened.
The no colour bar dance. Can you tell us a bit more about that, Atlantis? I didn't know about this at all.
Yeah,
it's a great story.
Yeah, definitely. So the colour bar is a phrase that makes reference to essentially segregation between people racialized as black and people racialized as white. So the colour bar would mean that black people weren't allowed to be in certain spaces. And that would have existed on maybe like public transport, certain public spaces and so on. So the no colour bar dance was an attempt in Lambeth, which is in South London. I grew up in Lambeth, I grew up in Brixton. And it happened at the town hall. It blew my mind when I was researching it because I'd passed that town hall every day for years going to school. And I just didn't know the history of it. So in that town hall, there was a dance and music was played, and it was deliberately inviting members of the marginalized black communities. So we're talking mainly Caribbean diaspora and the kind of white population of Lambeth to just come and dance together. That's it, you know? So we all know that a party can solve problems, and people came and they danced. And it was an attempt at racial unity at a time when there was lots of racial division. Simple. And in a way, music is still doing that. It's still doing that because you get even people who aren't engaging with anti-racism, even people who aren't challenging their own prejudices, they will dance to black music. You know, they will come together through that culture. And that's a powerful thing. And I don't think it's recognized enough, which is probably why I talk about Ed Sheeran at the end of the book.
Very interesting that, because Sheeran is second generation Irish. But yes, what you were saying there about, the elision of black music. But the roots of the Notting Hill Carnival, I mean, being Irish, I was interested in the roots of St. Patrick's Day, but there's the gay pride marches, how these marches and celebrations and carnivals came about. And you call it a healing party to begin with.
Definitely.
It's a kind of, we're here.
Yes.
You know, we want to be seen. That becomes celebration. It's wonderful.
100%. This is cultural community activism. That's how it starts. A group of people who have landed somewhere, you know, they are coming home as well, because if you're talking about the Caribbean diaspora, these are people that were part of the British Empire. So Britain was the mother country. That's what they were taught in school. My mum was taught that because she grew up in Ghana, formerly known as the Gold Coast. You know, it was a colonized country. So coming home was coming home. And you come home and it's not homely. You know, there's discrimination and prejudice. And so you start wondering, how do we make a home out of this place? And culture is always where you start, what you eat, what you wear, the songs you sing, the stories you tell. And so the Notting Hill Fair, that's how it began. It was a fair. It was a cultural fair, inviting Trinidadians and, you know, Barbadians and Jamaicans to get a bit of carnival in the UK. And goodness knows how much do we need a carnival in the UK. So Claudia Jones took that, and she was a real activist. She was writing, she was mobilizing, and she thought, how can we make this bigger? And then she worked with other people, and it grew into not just a fair, but a whole carnival. And what I think is amazing about the Notting Hill Carnival, it is, to this day, it's the biggest free festival in like Europe, you know, because it's free. And that's people forget that. It's not Glastonbury, it's not Beef, it's not Coachella. It's a free cultural festival and anyone is invited. And it's a massive celebration of the Caribbean, but just of London, of British culture, of the world, you know, and putting that diaspora right into the middle. And I think that's an important thing, because I'm not from the Caribbean, you know, but I feel part of Black culture, and I feel like we can all feel part of a culture, even if we're not from the country that it originates from. Oh, that was passionate, wasn't it?
But can we move on to that? Because your family background, you're from Ghana, and you talk about this song that you say is very important, Sweet Mother, to anyone
Yeah.
with African heritage. I didn't know this song. Will you tell us more about this and about your own heritage?
Oh, sweet, sweet mother. It's I had to include it because it's a song that I heard so much as a child. And when I think back to what was going on, when I was a child in the 1980s, the Ghanaian and West African Nigerian communities that had come over in the 1970s, this was, the first few years of them settling into life in Britain. So they'd have these parties. I remember these parties, and looking back, they were like, yeah, it was a cultural community event because everyone would be there, massive party, like all the uncles, aunties, all the people who you called uncle and auntie that weren't really related to you. Anyone was invited in, and this song would always be playing. And when it played, everyone got on the dance floor. Sweet Mother by Prince Nico Mbaga. And there's something about it which it's called Sweet Mother, so it feels kind of warm, the kind of parental love. And it was very much an African moment of celebration. I grew up in the middle of a very Jamaican community in Brixton, but I'm not Jamaican, I'm Ghanaian. And so this very African song was always a reminder that there's an African narrative of celebration that we're all part of. So I couldn't write about Black Britain and omit that song because it feels so pertinent to my personal history, but also to the wider Black family of which I'm part,
I learned so much from this book. One of the things that young people have been talking to me about lately is the difference between coming here with African heritage and then the Jamaican, and that there's some conflict there. I mean, as you say, it was a struggle to get out of the shadows of Jamaican cool. But even more, being African being used as an insult.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah,
Which is that speaks to the positioning of Africa, not to get too deep on it, but the conceptualization of Africa, which goes back hundreds of years. If you go back to the 19th century, to the 1880s, Africa was just carved up by European countries seeking to establish empires. So they sat around a table at the Berlin Conference and just said who gets what. So the positioning of Africa was never respected. It was seen as a valuable resource. But African culture, African people, African dignity was never on the table. So over time, the depiction of Africa has sort of been kind of skewed in that kind of negative way. And then you get the idea of it's been a dark continent where scary things happen, dictators, suffering, poverty. Then in the 80s, the famine in Ethiopia kind of skewed people's thinking even more. It was a place of just suffering, like an undeveloped third world. Are you serious? Third world? What does that even mean? Undeveloped, like what? So Africa's seen as being somehow not forward. And then because of that, people from Africa are not seen as offering, culturally offering things which are kind of like valuable and cool. And that was what I grew up in. It's changing. It's changing now. It's changing a lot. Now, Afrobeats is right at the top, Justin Bieber's doing songs with Thames and Wizkid. Are you crazy? Like, Afrobeats is what's going to be played at weddings. People are realizing that African nations are full of super cities and technology and can offer various cultures that the world is really, really hungry for. Afrocentricity has come around as a trend in like US hip hop, but it's come back around now into the mainstream, So there's been a journey. Every group of people, every community has a narrative, and the narrative of the African diaspora in this country is one which I really like talking about, because ultimately for me, it's a story of coming together, because now the Black community has embraced its various facets from all over the world, and it's merging in beautiful ways, not least of all in music.
there's a very skillful blending in this book of like the big official history, like the Race Relations Act, and big moments, for instance, as you say, the Lambeth no colour bar dance, and Bristol, the bus boycott, but also I mean, you talk about parties, but you talk about songs that celebrate these family gatherings and that celebrate these community events. And I think, church going and, clothes, as you talk about food, I think the official and unofficial threads of culture are very deftly woven in us.
Yes, I think that's such a good point. That's one of the reasons why I felt like I should even write it in the first place, because stories do get lost, and in the mainstream discourses, they're not even seen at all. So there are lots of things that take any community, any marginalized group of people will have narratives and stories and individuals that are very close to their histories. But in the mainstream, they might not even have, come up. So they might be completely invisible. And the problem with that is that the way that marginalized community is seen is forever kind of, stereotyped or prejudiced or kind of lacking nuance. And I can see that happening with what we can call Black Britain. I put that in inverted commas because that's a huge statement, that it gets stereotyped, it gets put into primary colors of this happened and then this happened, or it gets ignored. So the unofficial histories, and that's what really lives on. It's the stories we tell each other around the dinner table. It's the stories that we share with our kids. Your grandfather, your grandmother, your aunt. The unofficial histories are official. Like we need to know them all. And actually, the wider you open perspectives to welcome in all the narratives, the better everyone is as a result of that. It benefits everyone. It's for the collective uplift. I'm a very optimistic person. I believe in benevolence. I believe that people are essentially good if you cut everything away. And so my book is about giving people the tools and the truths that can enable them to have like maximum empathy, and I'm focusing on the Black British diaspora because there are serious conversations to be had at the moment about anti-Black racism, and I'm trying to push into that. And at the same time, we can celebrate it, and that's the beautiful part of it. Resistance, oppression, trauma, celebration, all happening at the same time through song.
You have a chapter in the center where you say we pause for a moment to talk about Stephen Lawrence.
Yeah.
And you work with young people, so do I, slightly older, but some of them are older teenagers. I wonder, are we in danger of young people not knowing the story of Stephen Lawrence? I mean, if you lived through it, it's so much there in your mind. Do young people still know about it?
It's a good question. It's not given huge priority, in terms of the curriculum. That incident and the wider narratives that it connects to aren't always kind of given space for conversation in schools. Therefore, the story itself won't be known. The Stephen Lawrence Day Foundation is doing amazing work to make Stephen Lawrence Day, April 22nd every year, a national day of recognition, and actually a day of optimism, looking at how to improve communities, classrooms, and career prospects for everyone. And so that work, the fact that we need that work, says a lot about where this particular tragedy sits in the collective consciousness. It's very simple logic. When something bad has happened, when a family has got a sense of shame or guilt about something, you hide from it. That's one of the instincts, to hide from your shame. Everyone does that, and to hide from it means to pretend it's not there. So the shame and the guilt surrounding what happened to Stephen and his family, and what is happening with, policing and criminal justice and the structural racism within, because it's shameful and uncomfortable, people would rather not know it's there. So I talk about Stephen Lawrence in pretty much everything that I write, because it's a moment of reckoning for this country And it's a moment of reflection that when you accept the truth of what happened and look at how it panned out over the next couple of decades, you know, the lack of justice, the fact that only 2 of his killers have ever been brought to justice to this day, the fact that Doreen Lawrence had to become a freedom fighter and change laws in order to have the killers tried twice, things like that. It's a moment of incredible importance for us as a nation and for our systems. And we'll never go forward until we accept that. So that's why right in the middle of the book, it's like a record scratch. And then I ask for silence. It's an interlude because in the middle of transformation for Black Britain, you know, back to life, back to reality, soul to soul, Afrocentricity, a new empowered sense of Black Britishness, you get this horrendous racial tragedy, this horrendous murder. And so we have to think about, well, what does that mean? And how do we go forward? Because we did go forward, but there's going forward and then there's everyone actually going forward, you know.
And one of the things you talk about, and it's implicated in the Stephen Lawrence case, of course, as well, about the stereotyping of young Black men.
Yeah.
That, for instance, the police were very slow to respond to that because, just another gang fight. But I thought the song you mentioned, that I've forgotten the name of it now, that names all the Black people who achieved things.
Black Boys.
Is it Black Boys? Of course Black it is, Boys.
Yeah. That's very important because institutional and structural racism is insidious and it's constant. You know, it takes no days off. It's like oxygen. It's everywhere and you breathe it. You know, it's like gravity. It's literally affecting everything all the time. And the knock-on effect of that is direct discrimination against particular groups. So, you know, Black Caribbean boys are excluded at higher rates than other ethnic groups. Black young people are 9 times more likely to be arrested than their white peers. For Asian, it's 3 times more likely. And these are the facts of institutional racism. So you have to understand that because people trick themselves or allow themselves to be tricked into thinking that we have a level of equality, like we're kind of past racism because they think, well, we haven't got people putting up swastikas on people's houses anymore. And we're not seeing in the news every other week a racist murder. So we're past racism. No, we're not past racism. We're still swimming in those waters. So a song like Black Boys, which is just designed to celebrate young Black masculinity, it's designed to say that we have a potential for change, that we're not the maligned stereotype figures that we're sometimes, you know, stereotyped as. It's an important thing for everyone because it's pushing back against very, very harmful stereotypes that play out in very, very real statistics like the ones I mentioned earlier.
The other threads that are coming through, I mean, you talk about the influence of American culture and hip hop and, you know, the roots of grime, but also writing in Lyndon Kwesi Johnson and Sonny's Letter and how this all came. And I love the chapter about like grime, it's protest music.
100%.
And that is a particular Black thing, you know.
Because, you know, I think when you're marginalized, your life becomes political, whether you like it or not. It's a crazy thing. And actually, any marginalized group will probably attest to that. Just by existing, you're a provocation, right? So Black-white racism, designed in the 1660s, way before any of us were around, it automatically created a debate over who deserves what, who is better, and so on. So just by flourishing in your own lived experience, you become a bit of a political activist. The minute you say, I am Black, and that means the minute you promote Black culture, the minute you wear what you wear, it's a political act. If I sat here in traditional Ghanaian clothing, you know, and I refuse to wear anything but, it's a political act, you know, because I'm saying the mainstream is that, but I am this. So, you know, and you're going to accept me. So music, which is fascinating because it's like an arena in which Blackness has been permitted to flourish. And I think part of that is because the music that has come from Black communities is so real and exciting and interesting that it's become a commodity for the white mainstream, you know? And that happens over and over again. Jazz, soul, R&B, rock and roll, blues, keep going, disco, hip hop, house, keep going, UK rap, grime, UK drill. It becomes commodified because there's something like which is just great. Like, who doesn't want to listen to rock and roll? Who doesn't want to listen to hip hop? But then in that, there is a political protest because the best music expresses something of your lived experience. That's why so many of these songs have got trauma in them. Black Boys has got trauma in it. Sonny's Letter's got trauma in it. Ghost Town's got trauma in it. 1980, a song about growing up in the 80s, has got trauma in it. It talks about poverty. It's mad. Vossi Bop's got trauma in it. He talks about the government. So you can't separate the expression, the cultural and artistic expression of life from the expression of trauma and then the protest that comes with that. And grime coming about in the 2000s from East London. East London didn't have much going for it. It's the poorer part of the city. Like most cities, the East is, young people without much making music with whatever they could. And this music was obviously going to be, fast, aggressive, confrontational. And it was called grime by journalists. Imagine if you made a song and I called it grime. That means filth. That's not a nice way of calling it. It's not a nice thing to label someone's music, but the journalists called it grime because it was, it was edgy. And yet it's still got that celebration. It's still party music whilst also being protest music. And I feel like that vein or that spine runs right throughout the Black experience in this country. We are protesting something because white supremacy as a construct has for decades, centuries, being, kicking communities down. And so you push back in the way you can, and it manifests in music often.
You talk about, for instance, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, and now Ed Sheeran, how people can draw on Black music, and there could be kids out there dancing to Black music and still holding racist views without acknowledging that what they're dancing to and enjoying actually has Black roots, or even Black performers often.
Definitely. 100%. I feel like when it gets into the mainstream, that's when the situation you just described is really happening. So, you would have got people shortly after Elvis Presley started popping, loving rock and roll music, right? Same people would have held deeply racist views against Black people, who created rock and roll. And I feel like the mainstream can appreciate, it can appropriate, two very different things. It can celebrate, but oftentimes, and it's why I talk about Ed, because Ed's amazing. Ed's an amazing artist, and he is definitely someone who has flourished in the context of Black music. His first few appearances I ever saw him was within the grime scene, really. That's where I first ever heard of Ed Sheeran. And he's made all sorts of music, and a lot of it is kind of what I would call Black music. But his big mainstream hits, people don't often recognize that they're in a heritage of Black music. And that is interesting to me because it means that there's a willingness to accept the cultural artifact, but to reject the narratives and the communities from which they come from. And I don't like that. I feel like we should accept the artifact and the community, and celebrate all of it, which is what I feel like Ed encapsulates, really. That's why I like Ed.
It's a bit like the old days with Bessie Smith and other performers. You can perform in a club. You can't stay in the hotels. You couldn't drink in the club. How
exactly.
People divide this. We do need to end soon, but to end on a high note, tell us about Stormzy and his importance for you, because you do have that shared heritage and you've written a lot about him. And I mean, he's become a cultural icon, really, hasn't he?
Yeah. Stormzy is phenomenal because it's so unlikely. You add up all the component pieces of the puzzle and it shouldn't it shouldn't end up with the picture that we have. This is someone who's, you know, main stage Glastonbury. This is someone who's at the Met Gala. I mean, what? He was at the Met Gala in a white suit. You know, this is someone that is an international superstar in a genre of music that was completely maligned and marginalized. Grime. He's a grime superstar, not hip hop. And he's from the kind of Ghanaian, you know, West African diaspora that I come from as well. One of the black boys that would have been definitely stereotyped against. And he's flourished. And he's also unashamedly political. He's called out prime ministers, which I think is a serious act of bravery. I can't imagine being in my 20s and making music that name checks the current prime minister and says, I am not happy with what you are doing to this country. So in terms of a generational voice, he is absolutely someone that is leading conversations, political conversations about what needs to change and why. There are others too. You know, Dave does it. He writes essays about politics for people to think about how we can change. Little Sims does it. There's all sorts of young artists. So Stormzy is an incredibly positive role model generationally, like not just for black kids. And also he has gone out of his way to uplift and promote. He's got an imprint of books, you know, murky books, which is again trying to broaden perspectives, and so on and so forth. So yeah, Stormzy had to be in there. Stormzy had to be in there because he's a remarkable young man who I think that Britain can celebrate as well as like Black Britain, you know.
Aware that we've been talking mostly about male artists, but there certainly is an importance in there on female artists and the voice of Black British women as well. And it's a terrific book. And I really liked, I was talking to adults last night. I keep talking to people about this book. I'm talking to people on the bus about it. I love it. About how accessible it is, that the short chapters, accessible language, you've got that fantastic illustration beginning each chapter.
Yeah. Ngadi Smart, big up Ngadi Smart for the beautiful illustrations.
Yeah. And it tells so much information in such an accessible way. I would recommend it to anybody. We wish you all the best with your shortlisting for the Jhalak Prize. It's so well deserved. And thank you very much for the book. I can't wait to pass it on to more people. And I hope, you know, every success with it. Thank you very much, Jeffrey.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's been great to talk today. So thank you.
Bye.